Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Rakesh Mohan, a professor in the practice of international economics and finance at Yale School of Management and a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale. Prior to this, Professor Mohan was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance. Today we talk with him about his book, Growth with Financial Stability, Central Banking in an Emerging Market, which provides a rare insider view into the development and workings of central banking and the financial sector in India. Welcome, Professor Mohan.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here for the Macmillan Report.
Excellent. Let's begin with your book. Give us an overview of it.
Well, as the title says, it's Growth with Financial Stability. As it turns out, the whole world is currently beset with financial instability. And therefore, in that sense, I think that the book has come out at about the right time. One of the defining characteristics of Indian economic policy and economic performance since our independence in 1947 has been relatively consistent growth, first somewhat slow for 30 years and then much faster the last 30 years. But we've always had financial stability, so we've not really had any banking crisis in our more than 60 years of development since independence. So what the book tries to do is to chronicle India's development path over the whole period, but focusing particularly on fiscal and monetary policies along with financial sector policies, and the role, of course, of the central bank, that is the Reserve Bank of India, in that. The first part of the book focuses on the coordination of fiscal and monetary policies along with financial sector policies, essentially making the point that it's extremely important to coordinate each of these macro policies as fiscal, monetary and financial sector policies. And to some extent, in a way, the problems that Europe is facing right now because of the crisis, that they have a real issue to do with the coordination of monetary policy and fiscal policies because they have unified currency, unified monetary policy, whereas different fiscal policies. So that is illustrating, in fact, the problems that arise when you don't coordinate both.
Right.
So the first part of the book essentially talks about how we have done that over the years, both during the highly controlled period and then towards a more open economy period. It makes the point that as you move, as in our case we have in the last 20 years, from being a relatively closed economy to an open economy, that you have to do this in a very gradual fashion so that each sector then responds appropriately. Of course, in real time, you never know what is a correct pace of liberalization, correct pace of economic reform, but somehow I think that we have managed that relatively well. The second part of the book focuses specifically on the financial sector, and once again how we have opened up the banking sector from, again, until 1990, between 1970 and 1990 it had become almost wholly government owned, and slowly we have introduced private sector banks and also made the government owned banks much more open and also developed financial markets at the same time. So again, it's a sort of a similar story of gradual reform on a consistent basis so that each institution responds appropriately to the changes that are being made, while we also been developing the financial markets, that is the equity market, other capital markets, the debt market, so that the system becomes much more market oriented and is much more open to the rest of the world. I had an earlier book which was published a couple of years back, which was called Monetary Policy in a Globalized Economy, a Practitioner's View. So that had concentrated fully on monetary policy. So in this book, the only aspect of monetary policy I really deal with is how Indian monetary policy coped with volatile capital flows. And once again, this is topical because one of the most interesting things in the current crisis in the West is that there were huge capital flows between Europe and the US in particular, in both directions, and how they've also had a role in causing some of the problems that exist. In our case, in the case of emerging markets, it's not just India, but other emerging markets in Asia and Latin America. cope with large volatility in capital flows. And we had to then adapt our fiscal and monetary policies, and using a host of different instruments, including capital account management techniques, to be able to have an independent monetary policy while having some capital account management, some capital controls, and along with development of financial markets, and a flexible exchange rate. And we are not that different in a way from the other emerging markets. And one of the interesting things about the current crisis really is that Europe and the US are in great difficulty, while emerging market countries in Asia and Latin America have not had financial sector problems as a consequence of this crisis, and India is among those countries. And so the third part of the book basically deals with that.
Okay.
And finally, there is a whole section of the book on the global financial crisis, and trying to document how it was somewhat loose or accommodative monetary policy in the early 2000s after the dot-com crash, combined with very light or light touch regulation, which basically took the regulators' eyes off what is really happening in the economy. And then we had all the problems of subprime, and then of course everything else that happened, including the huge explosion of financial innovations and derivatives that contributed to the crisis.
Okay, so we'll actually talk about each of those pieces. What I'm wondering is how your perspective differs on India's economic growth in comparison to what is widely believed about its economy.
Well, I'm not sure if it does differ, but nonetheless, I suppose that one thing that I would say is that there is a perception that we had a very poor economic performance in the first 30 years, since 1950 to 1980, and then a much better one. Now, that is certainly true in terms of growth rates, that in the first 30 years we had about 3 and 3.5% growth in GDP for over a 30-year period, and then average of about 6.5% last 30 years, and of course something like 8% in the last 7 to 8% last 10 years. So it's been growing continuously. So one of the points that I do make is that this has been a consistent story, and essentially going from low savings and investment rates to higher savings and investment rates. So it's been a consistent growth over the decades in domestic savings and investment. While of course in the earlier period the economy was much more closed, and the later period the economy was much more open, but a consistent story between different policy regimes has been this growth in savings and investment, and that is of course what is necessary to achieve economic growth. And the other point is that even the first 30 years was a big departure over the previous 50 to 100 years where we had zero growth. So that the 3.5% was very low by our current standards, but nonetheless it was a big departure from the previous 50 years.
Okay. What are some of the current challenges India faces?
Well, the immediate challenge, of course, which has now emerged really in the sense last 6 months to 1 year, that first, after the 2008-9 crisis in the world, we were able to cope with that quite well, so that we also did a fiscal stimulus like many countries did. We did a monetary stimulus as well.
And that's how you coped with
it primarily? And that's how we coped with it primarily. And we were able to restrict the impact on growth, so that in the first year, that is 2008-9, growth just went down to about 6.8%, and then it came back up to over 8% in 2009-10 and 10-11. It's now that I think most observers had expected that the world would be coming out of the crisis in 2011 and 2012, but because of the Eurozone crisis now, and also some of the problems in the United States to do with the fiscal situation and some breakdown in Congress in terms of the agreement on what to do, that we are now on the brink of another recession in the developed economies. So as a consequence of that, the immediate challenge, of course, is to cope with what may happen given the uncertainty in the rest of the world.
Okay. And
so that's the immediate challenge.
Okay. And how do you work to sustain long-term growth? What are some of the strategies you think would work?
Well, some of the issues that are emerging in India are much more to do with human resource development.
Okay.
One big opportunity we have is that our demographic situation is different from other countries in the sense that over the next 20 to 30 years, the proportion of people in the working age group, say between 20 and 50, would be much higher than the other groups, that is children and old people. So this is what people characterize as a demographic dividend, that we'll have that many more people working. So it's a great opportunity to have much higher growth. Also, with more people working, with lower, with fewer dependents, that you can have higher savings and consumption and higher investment. So this is really should be a period of very high growth. However, a problem really is that the stock of education, the stock of skills is low, even relative to some of our peers.
Okay.
And so a major challenge is to, one, make sure that the children now get good health, good nutrition, and good education for the future, but also that people who are already in the labor force, particularly say in the age of 15 to 30, who would therefore be there in the next 20 years, they're already in the labor force, that they need a lot of training, retraining, and perhaps adult education. As you are saying, that's a major issue. And along with that, of course, much better health services than we currently have.
Is India also focusing on technology?
Yes. We're trying to bring in new policies in higher education, in trying to open up that system as well, because in the last 40 years or so, we've basically had state-controlled higher education. Now there are many more initiatives taking place, because once again what we're finding is that there's a huge increase in the number of people wanting to go to college and getting higher qualifications, and of course the economy needs them to be able to invest in higher technology. So, for example, I'm now currently working on long-term transport policy for the country, and one of the things that we find is that we really do not have enough expertise in any of the transport sectors to be able to go in some sense to the next level of
What
transport
are the
services.
transport sectors?
All of them: railways, roads, civil aviation, urban transport, ports and shipping. And what has happened in the rest of the world, in developed countries in particular, of course, is there's now much greater coordination between the different modes. So you have all kinds of logistics companies which transport or freight over different modes in a very efficient fashion. And you therefore need a lot of standardization on how you transport these things. For example, a container can happily go from, say, a house or a factory to a truck to a train to a plane or to a ship very easily. But many things have to be organized to do that. Second, with GPS technology being available, it's also much easier to track everything.
Sure.
And you can also use that for automatic tolling and things of that kind. Third, with the expectation of much higher energy prices over the next 20 to 30 years, we probably need to invest much more in the railways and take both goods and passengers off the roads, because they're obviously much more inefficient, particularly in terms of energy use and also possible climate change issues coming up. So we really do need to invest a lot in energy efficiency in transport, because as we grow at something like 7 to 9% over the next 20 years, it will mean, for example, that if we do grow at that rate,
and that's 9 to 20% is huge.
Yes. So if we do grow, not 10% here, we will never do 20%. So if we do succeed in growing at that rate after hopefully the world crisis gets over, to give one example of the challenges ahead, that energy usage would go by a factor of 4 from where it is today to say 20 years from now, which means that the usage of fuels, coal, petroleum, all of this will go by a factor of 4, which means that you have to transport 4 times coal than you're transporting today.
Right.
Which means that you have to lay down a lot of railway lines, much more roads and so on. So everything has an implication for everything else.
Right, right.
And of course, along with that, all of this has to be done. The financial sector will have to be also expanding at a similar rate to be able to finance all these activities. One thing I haven't mentioned, which I should have much earlier, is agriculture, because still more than 50% of the people are engaged in agriculture. And if we are to grow at these rates, we'll have much greater urbanization, and also we'll need much more technology change in agriculture, much greater productivity in agriculture. That is much more difficult to do because it's because people are spread out all over the country, low education levels, low skill levels, and so once again we have to be investing a great deal in bringing new technology for different crops, different products, fruits, vegetables, poultry, meat, milk, everything.
And also the transportation,
and also
again,
transportation,
plays a
absolutely.
huge role in that.
And then transporting the stuff from the farm to the market, and all the things that need to be done in between in terms of building a cold chain, so that products from a farm can be preserved in cold storage, can go in refrigerated trucks. And so there's a huge amount of work to be done in the supply chain. And each of these means both investment in money, that is actually infrastructure, and also hopefully getting the best use of new technology available in the world.
Okay. You touched upon the global economic crisis when we began. What role do you think India has to play in that?
I think, unfortunately, not much really, except making sure that we don't contribute to it, which so far we haven't. I guess the only other role that we could play, hopefully, is that one thing that strikes me, for example, is that just like the United States, we are a federal system, and so there is structure of fiscal federalism in terms of what the different Indian states can do in terms of borrowing, and in terms of the kind of indebtedness that they can get into. There's certain disciplines to do with that. And so one of the issues that is arising in Europe is, and they're having a meeting today, the summit between the prime ministers, the leaders of the European countries today, and they talk about a fiscal union. And then obviously what they want is some kind of discipline that some central authority like the European Commission or the European Union will then have over the different European countries. Now we have that in the sense that we are of course an integrated country and not different countries, but we have a large number of states like the US does, and they all borrow in the market, but we do have certain rules under which they operate so that they don't get excessively indebted. So I think that maybe as the European Fiscal Union does start operating, if they succeed this evening, and they're probably discussing this as we talk here right now in Europe, that as they succeed and you have more of a fiscal union, perhaps I think different federal countries like the United States, India and others can then contribute in finding ways and means for Europe to resolve their problems.
Okay. Final question. What are some of the conclusions you reach in your book?
Basically that very traditional conclusions in a sense, that in order to grow on a consistent and financially stable basis, one, you must have responsible and prudent fiscal policy, that you do not get excessively indebted, and that you do contain populist pressures for fiscal expenditures. Two, that monetary policy should be flexible and not bound by one particular rule, and that you do need to make sure that you keep prices low, inflation's low, along with maintaining financial stability. And of course, in the case of an emerging market like ours, you really have to have an eye on inducing the financial sector to contribute to growth. Third, that whereas financial openness and economic openness is absolutely essential in the globalized economy, that you do need to make sure that things that are not under your control, like for example currently there's a crisis in Europe and the US, we need to make sure that we have appropriate capital account management techniques, including capital controls, to insulate ourselves from the ills of what happens in the rest of the world, but be open enough in terms of flexible exchange rates and open trade to get the benefits of globalization and protect ourselves from the ills of it.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
For more information about Professor Mohan and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.